Hello, and welcome to another episode of AI in the Classroom Daily. I'm Dan Cogan-Drew, co-founder and chief academic officer here at Newsela, and this is a podcast devoted to helping educators make sense of AI without the hype. In today's episode, I speak with Carey Swanson, Literacy Chief Program Officer at Student Achievement Partners. Carey started as a New York City teacher trained in balanced literacy, moved into school leadership, and then consulting. Now at SAP, she and her team translate research into classroom practice and back again, bridging researcher and teacher worlds. We have a great conversation about the purpose of school, the role of literacy, her key concerns about AI and education, and why we need to keep the text at the center of the learning, even or especially as the pace of change in AI quickens. We worry together about what becomes of the struggle necessary for learning, and Carey leaves us with her hope for the next 3 to 5 years, where she believes AI can really close gaps. So welcome. You're in for a great episode.
So I'm Carey Swanson. I'm the Chief Program Officer at Student Achievement Partners, focused on literacy. We are a small nonprofit. We're a national nonprofit. And our origin story is we were started by some of the lead authors of the Common Core standards right after the standards were put into the world. And the intention was to really focus on supporting what the standards actually looked like, both in practice and in instructional materials in literacy and math. We've grown a lot since then. That's still our core work, but we've expanded beyond just looking at standards-based instruction. And we look at evidence and research and practitioner experience in grade level, asset-based, linguistically sustaining, and joyful instructional practice. So areas of research that are often siloed that we try to bring together. And we do that in partnership with a lot of different folks in the field, working with school districts, working with education nonprofits, creating our own thought leadership, or working on instructional materials. And for me, connecting that to my experience, I started as a teacher, was a teacher in New York City and grew into school leadership. And this was in the early 2000s. When I first started teaching, I was trained I kind of leaned into a lot of the training that was happening in New York City in the early 2000s, which was very balanced literacy focused. To all the professional development that I could, really worked to support my students and later my teachers in understanding practices. And after many years in schools, I transitioned into consulting when I was leaving the classroom. I was leaving leaving schools, and wasn't quite sure what I was going to do next. My husband pressured us into leaving New York City, he will fully admit, because we've outgrown our space for our family. So I started consulting to try to learn about kind of education adjacent roles out there, and fell into just a whole world of reading research that truthfully I hadn't had access to as a classroom teacher or as a school leader. So while I was working for a few different ed nonprofits, I was also deeply learning. And as I moved into the role at Student Achievement Partners, ultimately about 10 years ago, I was fueled by this understanding that I had not been accessing the strongest evidence-based pedagogy in my actual world working with students every day. And so I really try to close that gap. And SAP has a lot of efforts where we try to both translate research to practice and then back again, because often researchers aren't well informed by teacher practice, and we really need those worlds to connect.
Great. Yeah. Thanks for making time to come on the show and talk with us. And as I'm just curious, you're talking about your professional history, and it sounds like in many ways, a lot of us who were in the classroom have come out of the classroom and we're working through some of the challenges and opportunities that we faced when we were in the classroom. And to go back into the classroom now for a minute in your own history, and then as you're working with educators, how do you think about like your sort of vision for learning and what your kind of image is of the portrait of the graduate? Like broadly speaking, like why school? Like what's the purpose?
Yeah, I love starting with that question and thinking about the K-12 or PK-12 experience holistically, because we often are like reducing to such fine grain size that we don't lift back up and really think about the why. So thank you for that. Ultimately, I would like to think that the purpose of school is to help students both see themselves and see a path for themselves where they can shine once they are done with their 13 or more years in education, and that school can also help fill the gaps or secure the necessary skills that will let them follow that path. I think we've talked for a long time about the phrase college and career ready. I don't think we've really done a great job of defining what that means and really showing a path for each and every child where they can value a wide range of options for them, but ultimately helping them to choose a future where they feel prepared to be successful and where they can truly shine.
You obviously spend a lot of time thinking about literacy in that context. So what role does literacy play in helping teachers help students fulfill that vision?
Yeah, there's the very clear baseline that reading and writing skills open doors, that not having those reading and writing skills are going to keep closing. That's absolutely getting complicated by AI right now. And I'd like to think that in some places, AI is going to help with access for kids who have traditionally really struggled with access. But I know that there's a really fine line between offloading the work of reading and writing to AI, and we're right in the thick of that right now. When I think about literacy in terms of how it can fit this vision of shining and thriving, which I'd like to think school can do, although I know we're still falling pretty short of that vision in a lot of places. I think literacy becomes both the mode of expression for children and for adults, right? How we can communicate both in discourse and in writing, and then a mode for reception. So we're always taking in information, putting out information. I have a former colleague who talks about reading and writing as inhaling and exhaling. Ideally, it's info in, info out, sense making happening in this way. And I really think that for where we are as a society right now, literacy has this opportunity to be a difference maker from a really human experience, right? So Regine Sims Bishop talks about windows, mirrors, and sliding glass doors, probably something your audience is familiar with. I actually think we don't look at the sliding glass doors metaphor very clearly. The idea that reading or engaging in text or even thinking about multimedia, right? Because we have an expansive vision for traditional text, but also video, multimedia. That's really the best way we have of truly understanding other perspectives and really getting a chance to experience other thinking, other points of view, other ways of being, whether literary or informational. And so a really thriving literacy experience can help students really engage in these different perspectives or understandings of the world. And they can also do it communally with their peers and have that sense of belonging that's really fostered in literacy classrooms. So I know that was a lot. There's like the basic skills of reading and writing, and then the ways in which we're then able to employ them to sense make.
And so I'd love to get into some of that. And you mentioned AI, and we're definitely gonna talk about that as well. I'm distracted by the inhaling and exhaling metaphor because it makes me think of, and in the context of AI, what is AI to the human act of breathing as we inspire and expire? And is it this sort of nozzle that we fix to our face? And to what extent is it mediating a very natural, or as many have noted, acquiring literacy is not a natural act. You don't come to read as you grow in the world. We'll circle back to that. But on the topic of AI, one of the reasons I wanted to talk to you is that you've written a couple of important pieces for educators about the role of literacy in the age of AI and changing world, what changes and what doesn't. And we're going to put those articles in the show notes, and folks should definitely read them. I wonder if you could just help us understand what prompted you to want to speak out, and what moved you to speak, and what was the sort of the core message that you wanted your readers and you would want our audience to take away from that, for your perspective here?
Yeah, I'll go in backwards order. I started a couple of years ago, just as I was learning myself about large language models. And we were like, look, it can write a poem. It writes it in less than a second. Just the new shiny object that LLMs became for those of us who were engaging at the time. And I know that was not everyone, but I started off with kind of an inquiry goal for my organization of, I hear people literally talking about AI revolutionizing education. The very first conference that I went to was called the AIR Show, and it was the AI revolution. That was in San Diego with a lot of ed tech razzle dazzle. And I wanted to see, okay, we work in translating research to practice. We don't work very deeply in ed tech. Let me just spend some time getting to know how folks are talking about content. I was set up on a lot of blind dates with people, I would say, like friend of friend, this person I know is doing this work. And the answer, honestly, that I came to from the people I spoke to was they weren't talking about content. There was lots of talking about saving teacher time. And I kept running into, I think, a lot of people who were still so dazzled by the quickness of the same thing. My friends and I, like saying, look, it wrote a poem about you and our names are in it. And isn't that funny? They were so dazzled by the quickness that they were conflating with something deeply meaningful for classroom instruction. That isn't completely gone now. I think that's still I think that's still how some folks are viewing things, especially folks who are not coming from a deep education background. There are more conversations now about outcomes than I've ever heard before. So that feels like there's a change there. But the other thing that I went back to is my own, as I said before, origin story of how I learned to teach, which is really learning based on the pedagogy of the people who were training me that was not necessarily vetted and research informed across all of the swaths of research that we have about how kids learn to read. And I was like, where's the pedagogy in these tools? And that was something that was really uneven. And we know historically, there's been studies on this, that teachers, when they learn something new, they actually don't let go of anything. They add it to their toolkit. And that can be really hard. Teachers become really bogged down. And I was thinking, how are we helping support educators in understanding the pedagogy of the product? I submitted a proposal to South by Southwest that did not get picked up, and it was called Who Trained the Bot? And it was supposed to be, this was several years ago, it was supposed to be about looking at how do we actually know where the content-based training is on the product that we're like suddenly getting user access for every teacher in our system. What we've started to do at Student Achievement Partners is acknowledge that is just as uneven, and the accessibility to strong research and evidence base is just as uneven as anything else we've ever put in classrooms. And the actual content connections, the purpose, that is not different. If your AI tool is not serving a really strong instructional purpose, it doesn't matter how cute it is or how quick it is. And if it is serving a really strong purpose, then we need to make sure we understand that really, so that we're training teachers in ways that's fair to their development and that kids are actually getting the most out of that. So some of the resources we've been working on at SAP are really meant to do that.
Got it. Yeah. So I'm struck by your comment about what is known about teachers assimilating new information. It's a sort of what the habits of learning are around when you discover something new or you have a realization, the extent to which you're letting go of what you previously thought or how this new information changes. And I can imagine that knowing that, given the amount of information teachers are asked to absorb, a lot of the picture can become quite muddled. I'm hearing three different things, and I'm not really sure where the guiding light is. And I think one of the things that you've done in your writing is to shore up, regardless of what changes, here are a few things that stay the same. And you're anchoring, so to speak, educators' thinking on some of what we know about the learning science and how that should inform pedagogy, regardless of where we are with AI. And I wonder, what are a couple of those like key points that you would want to remind us of?
We have a paper that Sue Pimentel, she was one of the lead authors of the Common Core Standards, and Meredith Lieben wrote not a long time ago, 6 years ago? I don't know. What's a long time in the world of education? I guess that's like an elementary experience in terms of impact on kids a while ago. And it's called Text at the Center. And the intent of that resource is really to think about what is specific about text-based instruction, which is that you cannot have a standards mentality that is agnostic to the role of the text, right? So it happens a lot in classrooms where it's a main idea lesson or it's a cause and effect lesson. And if you fail to acknowledge where the cause and effect is found in the text that you're studying, you miss all of the depth and rigor and honestly interest, joy of the text itself. And we found in these past few years that our conversations with folks in ed tech were really focused on similar things. So there's a lot of isolating standards tools, or here's a standards-based lesson plan. And it wasn't necessarily acknowledging what kids are actually reading or doing with what they've read. So my colleague Katie and I wrote the post Keep Text at the Center of a Changing World to really speak to how that through line is the same. Like now we have ed tech resources that can make text and maybe generate text much faster or make lesson plans much faster, but the thinking isn't any different around that like importance of text complexity, the sentence structure, the ways in which ideas are set up. All of those things really depend on the text we're studying.
Yeah, and that's one of the reasons I think for the emphasis and the growing awareness that students need knowledge-rich curriculum is that you, by nature of being a learner and being a novice in a subject area, you lack schema. You don't have the kind of tapestry of threads that you need to absorb new information. And if you're lily-padding your way from one topic to another in your reading in pursuit of a generic reading for central idea skill, you're floundering, right? You really have no basis on which to absorb this information.
Right.
And whatever weaknesses you have in your background knowledge they're not being addressed, if perhaps even made worse from the cost of the time that you're spending on this unproductive strategy.
Yes, absolutely.
On the topic of AI, I want to talk a little bit about what your aspiration is for what the impact your work will have. But I wonder if we could talk for a minute about productive friction and learning and the relationship of this to literacy and AI.
Yeah.
And I've been reading a lot of literature about the utility of productive friction, but also some of the conflicts, especially in the areas of product development, where products are designed, they make money by engaging you. And that work is hard work if you want the outcome to be learning, because learning, it needs to be frictionful.
Yeah.
And I wonder if you see conflicts in ed tech or in other products, I think mostly about ed tech, between the goals of the product to keep you coming back, which means that you have to enjoy it. You have to feel good about yourself, which you don't always as a learner, and the aim of all of this, that you should learn.
Yeah.
You see this tension showing up?
Everywhere. I think I see it in products, but I also see it in classroom discussions, because this question of AI to cheat versus AI to support the thinking work of whatever the goals are of the lesson, those come up in the classroom, right? And in the product, how the tool is supporting the lift versus taking over, passing the lift. This is actually the first topic that we really dug into. We worked with AI for Education, a nonprofit that's focused on AI literacy. And we did a very early now, I think a lot of the tools have developed since the time that we made this, but we did examples of where we saw practices that were supporting the productive struggle in the classroom and where we saw practices that were supplanting it. A really clear example is AI tool that writes for the student versus a rubric that gives feedback that the students then have to incorporate themselves. I actually think you can learn a lot about this. It'll be interesting to see how this conversation continues with kids as they grow up as AI natives. We will never experience the world that way. I've noticed my own self. I'm going to actually show. I hand wrote notes for this because it helps me to ready my brain. I'm not reading them. My eyes aren't on those notes, but there are studies that show that writing things down helps with the increased working memory that it takes to then recall that same work. And I've noticed my own self, like when I am relying too much on a large language model, and then I don't remember as well what it was that I was even putting on the page, right? And so I think there is something about building that metacognition in our students and in grown-ups around, is this making the task quicker, or is this helping me attend to the learning? And making the task quicker is, I think, a red flag around how adults are using AI tools and how students are experiencing AI-infused classrooms.
Yeah, and absolutely agree. I have the same tendency and I have the same nervousness. Even in the creation of the podcast, I worry that I'm over-relying on the AI as a thought partner, and I've built some assessments in to ask me about the work that I've done. Do I even remember what these podcasts were about? And how proficient am I? Because I deeply care about this. Right. Not all learners care about all learning.
Right.
And so they have their own incentive.
Right.
And as learners, they also don't have the metacognition very often. That is a habit of mind they need to build. And it has to be based on knowledge and their own experience of what it means to know something.
Yes.
They don't know what that feels like. They don't have that awareness.
Absolutely.
I want to cover just like the hope that you have for, and I'm going to ask you for one recommendation of something that our audience can turn to as a resource to think further about this. But what impact do you hope your work will have in 3 to 5 years, given where we are today?
Yeah. 3 to 5 years is tricky. I like to say that I'm both cautiously optimistic and realistically pessimistic as an educator. And I know change is really slow in our field. So I think one of the reasons that AI keeps coming up is it's without precedent how fast it is, right? And keeping up with that has kept folks really on their toes who are trying to do so. But I just keep going back to I'm going to keep saying origin story. I'm not trying to say that I'm a superhero, but I keep going back to my origin story. I am hopeful that we can increase access for educators around what works in classrooms, not just in research environments, but in classrooms. And that is a place where I do think the speed can help us if we commit to really looking at quality and not just having the kind of new shiny object or I want to get my thing off the ground mentality, but sharing. If we commit to a real culture between ed tech and research and practitioners of learning from one another, I think there's a lot that can really be done there. And so if this work is successful, I will play a part in building those bridges and helping to make sure that the conversation is rooted in things that aren't just numbers of license or growth of a company, and that are really about quality experience for students.
I love the way you're bringing that back to your own origin story and that like what you didn't have as an educator, access to the research and the speed. I think you raise a great point about the relative speed with which education moves, so to speak, broadly, and AI moves. And there's a huge contrast there that produces a tension that can be difficult to manage, but it can facilitate the speed with which research reaches practitioners and reinforms the research to your initial point. And that feels pretty wholly valuable.
Yeah.
Don't have much concern about speeding that up.
That's right.
That would be a good thing.
That would be a great thing.
That would be a good thing. To follow on what we've been discussing, what's one thing you'd recommend to our audience? A book, podcast?
Yeah, I will. So I'm gonna recommend 2 books that are 3. I hope that's not cheating. But for folks who are really thinking about literacy instruction at the core of what they do, Meredith and David Lieben have written 2 books, Know Better, Do Better, and Know Better, Do Better Comprehension. And they were some of the first folks that I started working with when I was consulting and then later at Student Achievement Partners. And the books are really accessible versions of a lot of that research and also storytelling of real experience with educators, which I really love that combination, and really capture a lot of the practices that my work really tries to capture as well. So I think those are great accessible literacy books. And then we didn't talk as much about this, but Goldie Muhammad's work in particular, she has I believe her first book, she had done a lot of research called Cultivating Genius. And if it's not her first book, it's a really strongly popular one. I think it's rooted a lot in what you started with around the purpose setting for school and how we can create asset-based classrooms where every child, especially children traditionally marginalized by school, can thrive. And if we take the bones of those 2 books and we put them into practice or tools or resources, I think we'll be doing really right by kids and teachers in a way that I find inspiring.
I love that. And I think that's such an important, the asset, making school a place where students feel that their assets are being cultivated we spend a lot of time as adults worrying about what children aren't or what they don't have and trying to remediate. And I sometimes reflect on what my life would be like if I spent 2, 3, 4 hours a day working on the things that I felt least excited about and least proficient in, and how excited I would be to get out of bed in the morning and go to the place that focused all my attention and energy on these things. And we do it for the best of reasons, the best of intentions. But
We create a hard space
but
for
it
kids.
it colors
absolutely.
Exactly. It colors their experience. But I think that's an inspiring vision, and that's the thing that we should be aiming for. So one other question I did want to raise, and this was in the spirit of the conflict we were talking about between the desire that products had, the motivation or the outcome that they're going for in terms of engagement. Do users come back to the platform?
Yeah.
And there's a tension between that and the outcomes, because the outcome, the process of getting to the outcome of learning is frictionful if done well. And somehow teachers know and learn and become better at motivating students to persevere through the friction to the experience of learning and to the benefit that's on the other side of all of that. Products have different methods to try to do this. Some of them are more sinister than others. And I'm wondering, where, if we take the technology out of the equation and we just look at teaching, do you see this as a dynamic that precedes or sits alongside any use of technology? Are teachers, are people themselves susceptible to the same conflict? That is, I'm trying to teach my class something, and I also want to have a good day today, and I don't want to fight with my kids, and I don't want them to be lost because I'm overloading their short-term memory because I haven't set this lesson up properly, or even if I've done everything right, we are not feeling it today.
Yeah.
And I want to maintain a relationship that is positive, and I want them to look forward to class tomorrow. Do you see, is this as much a human dynamic as it is a product human dynamic?
Yeah, I think there is such a well-intentioned but likely instinct to simplify the experience of being in schools or of learning. And what's interesting about thinking about the kind of ed tech dynamic is what we know, and this is not research that I'm knowledgeable about, but I'm positive that there's stuff out here. We know that kids like tricky challenges that they feel well positioned to solve. And I think of my son in video games. And he has stamina beyond belief to keep trying to get to, I don't know, the next level. I don't know. What do you do in Minecraft? To get to his perceived experience of success through challenge when it comes to video games. And he will sit and he will research and he wants to watch YouTubers showing how they got to the next challenge and then try to mimic that experience. And that is actually learning, right? And that is the best form of learning. But there's a real human element. I talk about the tendency of teachers to give students the answer and then listen to it back, right? And that is because they want them to experience success. But often we are conflating, naming, like revoicing an answer or getting to the next part of the lesson with learning. And yes, I think that's prevalent far outside of just new AI or ed tech tools.
Yeah, so it's interesting, the comparison you make to video games. That's a whole other topic. But yes, I think video games are good for learning. Good video games are good for learning. Not all video games are good. And there is this notable dynamic of, and you can see this in classrooms where, and I was guilty of this myself, I think I was eager to believe that my students understood X so we could move to Y. And I would take almost the barest evidence of this in a class of 25. One kid would be like, I got it. And I'd be like, great, we all got it. And we'd move on. And I really had not verified. And then the gaps and the holes would show up later, much to my frustration that I hadn't actually ensured that every student, it's a sort of, I think Jay McTighe says, I'm gonna hold you innocent of learning until you're proven guilty by evidence, right? Like that I can't learn this for you. And I need demonstrable proof before I can be certain that you're ready to move on. Right. And I wonder, like what you described of the teacher handing a student the answer and then hearing it back, in another context, sounds a little bit like AI.
It sure does. It sure does. Now it's really interesting. It's like AI has the human tendency of wanting to do exactly what we're talking about, which is a little scary. And it is a human tendency. I have a video I use of my daughter. She's 15. She was 5 and my son was 1.5, and she is in the back of the car and I'm just videoing them because they were being cute. And she was like looking at a magazine and she said, "How many fingers do you have, Felix?" And he goes, 2. And she goes, 10. And he says, 10. And she goes, that's right, 10. And I use it with teachers all the time because it's just indicative of this instinct we have where we want to support teaching is a helping profession. We want to support the kids to get it right and sometimes then miss where we're just feeding it to them, which is exactly what AI chatbots are doing for us all the time. So that was absolutely
and
true.
maybe we shouldn't be surprised because designed by humans,
trained by
reflect
us, right?
humans.
Absolutely.
This has been really great.
Yeah.
Really appreciate your thought and your time.
I'm going back. We didn't get there, but I'm going back to the breathing metaphor and thinking about what is AI.
Yeah,
the
it's
mask?
super interesting.
Is it the ventilation?
Yeah, is it
tube?
like scuba gear? What is this thing?
Yeah. I'm gonna think on that. You might see that in future writing.
Okay. Yeah, metaphors I find like I'm trying to make sense of something.
Yeah.
You're like, it's like this.
Absolutely.
And that and the other. So they're helpful.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for coming on the show and for the recommendations and for your writing. And we look forward to keeping in touch and following your work as you go.
Thanks so much, Dan.
Thanks, Carey.